Hello, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your area of expertise, please?
My name is Dr Geraldine Scanlon and I work at Dublin City University in Dublin in Ireland. My area of expertise is inclusive education. I started my career, my very early career, as an early education practitioner. So I would have over about 20 years experience in early education. However, when I moved into training myself, when I became a teacher myself, I became interested in the whole area of children who got left behind. And at that time in Ireland, we were just beginning to develop our whole inclusive policy towards children. So for my PhD, for studying in Ireland, I looked at the self-esteem levels of children who had dyslexia, ADHD, and compared them to children who didn't have those deficits. And what I found was that these children saw themselves as being different. And then I also conducted some other experiments that looked at the attitudes of teachers towards these children and found that while nobody had ever told these children that they were bad or not accepted, they felt that way, and this was developed through the interactions that the teachers had developed. So there began my interest in changing attitudes of teachers towards being more positive about including children, and my work has taken me through that process.
When we talk about inclusive education, what exactly do we mean?
Interestingly, the School of Inclusive Education would have began looking at just specific needs of specific groups. So I suppose if we're to look at definitions, there can be a broad definition or a narrow definition. And AINSCO will tell us, for example, that the broad definition would be whereby we serve the needs of all children. And the narrow definition is where we only serve the specific needs of some children. So inclusion really is the broad definition. It's by looking at the needs that we need to serve where all children would have needs, irregardless of whether they have additional needs. For example, a disability like dyslexia, or a physical disability, or mild general learning difficulties.
Can you give us a few examples based on your experience? For instance, how does a blind child learn to write, or how do we treat a child with autism who doesn't like the music during the group activities in the kindergarten?
Okay, so in order for a child who is blind to learn, they need access to materials, particularly through their senses. And this has to be, in the early years, geared around things like sand, water, Play-Doh, paint, smells, sounds, and those different types of activities that will enable them to develop their senses that will help them navigate their world. A child with autism who doesn't like music is quite normal for a child with autism not to like music. However, in order for that child to be included, what we can do is perhaps put a set of headphones on them and hold their hand, and they don't have to hear the music anymore. It's a very simple step, but that's what I mean by inclusion, without actually excluding the child and saying, you go out of the room now because we're going to have music. If we want to have inclusion, we have to be able to try and see the world from their perception. A child for autism, for example, their brain functions completely different. So for us to impose what we see as our normality on them is morally wrong.
You have had the chance over the past week to visit most of the kindergartens that UNICEF and partners have chosen to implement such inclusive education initiative. What are your first impressions or recommendations? How are those kindergartens treating children with disabilities?
Well, first I will say that from an inclusive perspective, I look at all children. I don't only look at children with disabilities. And the reason I say that is that the process here in Bulgaria is extremely teacher-led, which goes against the principles of early education. Early education would tell us that children need to be the leaders and that the teacher is merely a facilitator of their learning. And what I witnessed in many cases was where the children are just passive vessels and they don't participate in the activities. The teacher tells them what they have to do, even down to what colour that they have to draw a line in, and the child has no choice. If we're to talk about inclusiveness, choice is the centre, I suppose the central concept that underpins that whole notion of inclusiveness. What I saw was perhaps that teachers were very dedicated, but dedicated in the model that they're used to working in, not necessarily dedicated to the needs of the child and to progress the child's learning. Also, I witnessed teachers being very affectionate and very lovable towards the children, but at the same time no provision for them to access the curriculum. For example, the little blind boy that I witnessed, who was in a loving and caring environment but had no access to the curriculum because there was no materials provided for him. So in that regard, we're doing that child a huge injustice, and we're actually excluding the child from this whole notion of becoming a future citizen of Bulgaria. How is he to become a future citizen of Bulgaria if we don't allow him access to the curriculum?
You've also had the chance to talk of some of the major relevant stakeholders, interested parties in this whole process. For instance, the Ministry of Education and some of the regional authorities and so on. In your view, what is their vision for the inclusion of children with disabilities? Are they going in the right direction?
I think I've changed that over the last few days. What was interesting was that when I would visit the kindergarten, the child with special educational needs was pointed out to me, and this would go against the whole philosophy of inclusion. However, I think that when I spoke about what the concept of inclusion actually is, that they understood that the child was to be integrated and amalgamated with other children, not specifically just attended to the detriment of also attending to the other children. So the stakeholders, I think, are interested, and they know that this has to be progressed, but I don't think they actually quite understand yet what inclusion is. And I think they will only start to do that once they engage in the project and start to actually look at the different sets of indicators and how they welcome parents and how they cooperate with each other as staff and how external agencies cooperate, etc. Once they start doing that, the minute they start doing that, they become more inclusive.
You've already mentioned how important it is for the child to be active, to have an active role in the kindergarten and in the group among his or her peers. Can you tell us a bit more about the concept of child participation and how it empowers and includes the child?
Okay, so child participation would be, for example, where you have these what you call teaching episodes. In other settings across Europe, you would see children being offered different types of activities and having free choice to do that. So, for example, at one table, children could be cutting and pasting and creating pictures, whichever they want to create. At another table, children could be playing with water. At another table, children could be engaged in pre-writing skills, and at another table or centre, the book corner, the child could actually be engaged in books. But the same theme is running across the activity, and the same language is being used, and the teacher moves from the table to table and assists the child in their learning, as opposed to dictating how they should learn that material. Children learn in a concrete and interactive way, not by being talked at, but actually involving themselves. So by this word participating actually gives them the active ingredients whereby they are actually learning by doing, and that's how young children learn. They learn by doing, and they experience success, and success is very, very important. There is no right or wrong way to do something. The important part is that I participate. So by participating, I increase my motivation. Piaget will tell us that the minute a child doesn't experience success, their motivation becomes reduced, and because of that they withdraw from their environment. He would also tell us that in order for us to develop and for children to develop, they need to be active in their environment. So if they're not experiencing success, they will withdraw. So that's why it is so important for children to actually experience success to whatever level that they appear to understand that their success is. then that is what I mean by participation.
Do you think that it's time for a greater shift in public perception when we talk about children with specific needs or disabilities? I mean, should we start looking at their specific needs as an opportunity in terms of diversity, not necessarily as a problem or as a challenge?
Yes, one of the key concepts in inclusion is that we view the child, we don't view the child as a problem. We don't view negatives as, we don't view the child being negative because they have a problem. And we view differences as being positive as opposed to negative. So from that perspective, looking at the needs as opposed to the label that a child might have is much more important, because we don't necessarily have to have a label. We all have needs as human beings. Some of us have more needs than others, and that is what is the kernel of inclusion, really, is this whole notion that we are addressing the needs of the child. The child may not need that intervention all of the time, but at this moment in time, that is what they need. So if we look at the needs as opposed to the category or to the label, then that will help us to involve the child more and also to include them.
Can we ever achieve an ideal, a full state of inclusion?
No, because inclusion is a fluid activity. We will always have people who are different, because by the nature of human beings we are diverse and we're different. So while a setting might think that they have just got there and they have, you know, that they've progressed and they've become really inclusive, a new child comes along with a different set of needs. So therefore, or a parent comes along with a different set of needs. So therefore we can't ever fully, I suppose, inclusion can never be fully realised, but we have to view it as a fluid system, and we can never say that we are an inclusive society, because challenges come up every day.
There are many parties, many stakeholders involved in this whole process. So is there some kind of hierarchy when we talk about inclusion, or not?
There is a huge hierarchy that I have witnessed here in Bulgaria, and one of the main ones lie in the universities who are responsible for teacher training. They really need to embrace and look at how teaching has changed in the 21st century, and really to engage in other methodologies as opposed to what has been done traditionally. So that is part of the hierarchy as far as teacher training is concerned. The hierarchy then, it does occur amongst different groups, so between different groups of professionals. But again, if we're talking about inclusion, we need to look at that, to bring that together as a collaborative process, so that you are no better than I, because we all bring to the table something different. This child has needs, and we all have different ways that we can help the child, but because I'm a psychologist, or I'm a resource teacher, or I'm a speech and language therapist, doesn't make me any better than you. So therefore that we work all together, and the hierarchy has to be broken down into a collaborative approach, as opposed to this tiered system, which is that, or even with teachers are a huge barrier there as well to children's participation.
Based on your experience, your observations, is it often enough, or on the contrary, that parents, teachers, the authorities or experts ask the mere question, how can I help you, when they talk to the child, when they interact?
Yes, I think one of the most powerful things you can do for a child is to ask them, how can I help you? What can I do that can help you learn better? What can I do that can help you make friends easier? Those type of questions. Children understand those questions, and people will say that, you know, children don't know that they are different from others. They only become different because we treat them differently. And we can't treat everybody the same, it's not possible. You have 5 children in a family, and a parent will say, well, I don't know why that one ended up being on drugs because I treated them all the same. You can't, because we all have different temperaments and different types of personalities. So it is our interaction with them, but it is the attitude that we have towards that child will actually enable them to have a voice and say, well, I would like to be able to work independently, or I would like to be able to draw, or I would like to be able to know my numbers, or whatever, and that's where you start.
Is it morally right or morally wrong to teach behaviors to children who are sometimes merely unable to develop those specific behaviors?
Absolutely, and also unethical. From the perspective of a child who has autism, for example, a child who has autism has their brain functions in a completely different way, and neuroscience gives us a huge amount of new information that was never available to us before about the impact on how the child with autism reacts to their environment. For example, children with autism don't have humour, they don't get facial expressions, and they don't get with the fact that they might be boring the pants off you because they're still talking about the universe that they love. However, and also another part of that is that that they I suppose they don't realise that you have a state of mind, so they don't understand that you have an opinion. They only see that they have an opinion. You can teach that to some children with autism, but to other children you can't. And you can't force a child to be sociable when they don't have the actual neurological capability to be sociable. So that's what I mean when I say about teaching behaviours that is not appropriate for those children, because they are quite happy in their world. They don't want to be mixing. I mean, the world is made up of differences, and if we were all the same, we would be very boring societies.
My final question would be, how do we develop an inclusive culture in the whole society? Can you perhaps tell us of some experience in your own country?
Yes,
the progress that you have made in your country?
I think the way that we have become a more inclusive society, while we would have been similar. Anybody who was different was put away in an institution, and what you would have seen happen in the rural areas was that people didn't want their children to be away from home, so they kept them with them. So rural areas in Ireland were very much responsible for the beginnings of inclusion in many ways, because the community accepted and looked after that child with the parents as well. However, I suppose it has been a slow but sure progression towards educating ourselves. Education is the key, and coming out of our bubble and realising that there is a bigger world out there, and that there are different value systems and different attitudes that exist. And in Ireland for many years we didn't have any type of immigration at all. And then we did. So we were forced to actually face up to the reality that there were people coming from lots of different parts of the world to this very small island, because Ireland was so prosperous at the time. And it did create tension, but ignorance actually breeds contempt, and the government would have made very strong efforts to run public campaigns, and schools particularly are very, very good at running campaigns as well about different cultures and different celebrations and what's important and customs, etc. However, I think what we did find difficult was that when people came into our country, they were not prepared to learn, you know, any of our culture, etc. And we didn't want to necessarily go down the road of where Great Britain has ghettos of people who don't have any English and are second and third generation still living the same type of life that they would have lived back in, for example, Pakistan or India. So that hasn't happened. We don't have ghettoised areas now yet in Ireland. So public campaigns has been a big part of that, and I think the Irish by nature are very empathetic and welcoming, and I think that has been a huge culturally that's the type of people that we are, and that has had a huge effect on how we welcome and help newcomers into the country. We still have many challenges to overcome, and we're by no means perfect, and there would still be people who would suffer racial abuse and prejudice, etc. But I do think we are becoming much better, because there are people who won't stand for it and will challenge people on it and tell them that that's not appropriate. So we do stand up for other people's rights, and we have many organisations that stand up for people's rights as well. And social media is a huge asset and allows that to happen. For example, Twitter campaigns, Facebook campaigns, etc. I suppose help to disseminate the information that's required to help break down these attitudes of people. But it will take a long, long time. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure we'll ever come to the full realisation of inclusion, but we can try.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.